So I posted a paper that I wanted you guys to read. It's from the Health and Human Services, which is a government agency. It's from their website. It's actually part of a database of papers that are maintained by the National Institutes of Health, which is actually where this came from. Anyway, it was published in Transactions of GIS in 2016, and it's an analysis of supermarkets and their redlining index in Hartford, Connecticut. And so there were a couple of things that I wanted you to take out of this. One is they have a relatively decent literature review of information that has been published in the past on supermarket redlining. And so I thought it would be useful to you to have some vocabulary to talk about these things. So on page 3 of this document, which isn't the actual page number in the journal that it was published in, but on page 3 they define food desert, and they indicate that food deserts have been defined in a variety of ways in the past. What would your definition of what a food desert is be? Right, is be? Native speaker of English. How would you define a food desert after having read some things about food deserts now?
It's a place where like good and affordable food is available.
Yeah, so where good and affordable food, and by good I assume
so like not like McDonald's.
Yeah, so fast food outlets wouldn't be considered as part of the equation. You would be thinking of healthy food, full service supermarkets that would have like a produce section, so you could buy fresh vegetables if you were so inclined to do something that crazy. Define close in the context of food deserts. Like how far away does a supermarket have to be for it to not be close?
A mile or
Okay, in many cases it's considered to be a mile or further away. In other cases it's considered to be 5 miles away. Can you guys think of all of the full service supermarkets that are located within 5 miles of Williamsville College? 5 miles as the crow flies.
Ivy, Price Chopper.
Hy-Vee, Price Chopper 1 and Price Chopper 2.
Yeah.
There are 2 of them. That's a terrible marker. Why is this thing still in existence? Yeah, there are 2 Price Choppers here in our little small bird. Price Chopper on 291 south and Price Chopper on 291 north. What else is around here? Walmart would be considered because it has a produce section and grocery section. Target.
I like Sam's Club.
Oh, I don't ever even think of Sam's Club because I don't ever shop there. Not a member. Aldi?
Is there like natural something?
There's a Natural Foods. Out there where Natural Foods is, there's also wait, where's Natural Foods at? Where's Natural Foods at?
It's like up by the highway.
152 and 35. Go out a little further. First Watch, area, First Watch and Old Chicago Pizza, there's a place out there, what's that place called?
Sprouts.
Sprouts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Does Liberty exist in a food desert? No, we have tons of supermarkets available to us, all within a relatively short driving distance. So when we talk food deserts, we're not talking about Liberty, Missouri, clearly. When they talk about supermarket redlining, what do they mean by that? So this is slightly different than redlining that was done in terms of housing back in the 1930s. How do they make the distinction between what they call supermarket redlining and more traditional residential redlining? This is on page 4 and 5, bottom of page 4, top of page 5.
So it's a spatially discriminatory practice among retailers of not serving certain areas based on their ethnic minority composition rather than on economic criteria such as the potential profitability of operating in those areas.
Okay, and then they go on to say what are some of the signs of this in the next sentence. They basically talked about supermarkets closing,
Relocating
supermarkets relocating
or just down up
to the suburbs in many cases. And the third thing is, failing to open new stores when old stores close. So these are the kinds of things that end up leading to areas that don't have food availability. You guys weren't around back then, but I guess it was probably about a decade ago, they built a new Hy-Vee. You know the new Hy-Vee? You guys have been to the new Hy-Vee? It's no longer the new Hy-Vee, it's just the Hy-Vee. Do you know where the old Hy-Vee was? Feldman's. How many of you golf? Anybody golf? You golf? How far can you hit a golf ball with a driver off the tee?
I do say over 280 probably.
Okay, you could hit a golf ball from the old Hy-Vee to the new Hy-Vee. Why did they build a new Hy-Vee and close the old Hy-Vee? The new Hy-Vee is right across, literally right across the street from the old Hy-Vee. You guys know where Feldman's is, right? You guys know where I'm talking about.
I mean, they need to profit more.
So the new Hy-Vee is bigger than the old Hy-Vee. It's certainly nicer than the old Hy-Vee. But was it really necessary eyes of the people who run that supermarket chain.
I mean, you can tell competition's obviously super high in the area, so, I mean,
So competition is super high in the area.
yeah.
Why build a new grocery store in an area where the market is already saturated with grocery stores?
New customers.
But aren't those customers hard to win? If there's already 7 or 8 other places to go shopping?
Be very hard to win, that's why something like building an absolutely huge superstore is what they decided to do for profit.
Is what they decided to do for profit. What could they have decided to do other than that?
Relocate to somewhere like miles away.
They could relocate it to someplace miles away. They could have left that original store standing, and if they were going to build a new store, they could have built that new store where?
Somewhere with no grocery stores.
Someplace where there's no competition for customers at a grocery store. It's weird. Do you not find it weird, you as a group, not you, Adam? How many of you are business majors again? What's the first rule of business? I mean, okay, it's maybe not the first rule of business, but it's a good rule of business. I'm not a business major, by the way. They do teach you guys things in business classes, right? You guys ever watch the show Shark Tank? I do not watch the show Shark Tank. It seems like a terrible waste of time. What are the people doing on Shark Tank?
Trying to convince investors.
They're trying to
Yeah,
convince
right.
venture capitalists to invest in their idea.
Yeah.
Because presumably they have an idea. What's the value of their ideas? Like, why would a venture capitalist invest in a particular person's idea?
There's a potential for profit.
Potential for profit. What's a good way to make sure that you're going to profit off of something?
Dominate the market.
Okay, so define, what do you mean when you say market?
Like your customer base. I guess.
Okay.
Potential customer base.
Actually, that new Hy-Vee doesn't look that much bigger than the old Hy-Vee. This is the new Hy-Vee. This is the old Hy-Vee. I've never actually looked at them from an aerial view. Certainly has a bigger parking lot than this one does, and I guess there is a slight difference in square footage, but it's not a colossal difference in square footage from the looks of it. So anyway, I'm pretty sure you could hit a golf ball from here to there, and at the very least get it to the new Hy-Vee on a bounce, probably, especially off of the parking lot. Find a need and fill it. Who's your market? Your market are people who need the product that you produce. On the Shark Tank, one of the questions I hope that those venture capitalists would ask the people is, what market need are you filling? What's the old saying? Build a better mousetrap and the world will be a path to your door. Well, why is that saying a saying? Well, because people have mice, they need mousetraps. Mousetraps are notoriously poor at doing their jobs, so if you build a better mousetrap, you have a winning product there because you are filling a potential need. So if one of the things that a business should be doing if they intend to maximize profits is put their product in the hands of people who really need it. This is one of the things that continually amazes me about Congress people, members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate. For bunch of people who are presumably college educated, many of whom, although not all, but many of whom come from business. They have a terrible sense of business and economics. Can you give me some examples of decisions that have been made in the last 10 years in Congress that have totally ignored like solid neoclassical economic theory? Yeah, Aiden.
This would be cheating enough to go past 10, but paying for the war in Iraq by, well, not paying for it, because we're not going to raise taxes, we're just going to, in fact, we're going to cut taxes and spend more.
Well, okay, so, but that doesn't really have much to do with business. That's a different realm. I'm thinking of business-related things. I realize that war is a business also, but it's not a business in the way Hy-Vee is a business.
I mean, in general, like tariffs are a horrible business decision.
Tariffs are a terrible business decision. Why are tariffs a bad idea?
It raises costs for both the consumers and the producers.
Does it raise costs for the producers?
I mean, well, no, not actually.
If you're a Chinese,
well, it depends.
if you're a Chinese
Yeah.
corporation, you're producing a product and importing it into the United States, and the United States slaps a tariff on it.
Yeah.
Does that cost the Chinese firm anything? It might cost them business. They might experience declines in sales, but it doesn't increase their cost directly. Who does it increase the cost up for?
The U.S. Whoever the corporation is that's using the manufacturers.
Yeah, so whoever's buying that imported good is the one who pays the tariffs, which was weird when Trump said that he was going to slap these tariffs on China,
Well,
and China was going to pay them. What's that?
Well, this whole thing is raised GDP and then slaps a bunch of tariffs in.
Yeah, it made no sense to me that China was going to pay the tariffs. The country doing the exporting to the other country doesn't pay the tariffs. The tariffs are paid by the people buying the product in the place that it's being imported to. So it increases prices on the consumer of the product, not the producer of the product. Now, if you are importing steel from China and you're in the business of making cars, then it increases your cost because you had to pay the tariff. But that's an indirect consequence of the tariff. So tariffs are a bad idea. What's another bad idea? It's come down the pike in the last 10 years.
I mean, in general, closed borders are bad for business.
How so?
You want to maximize potential client base.
So closing borders to migrants or to goods?
To migrants, like just people, like legitimately closing off a group of people from entering a place declines client base. Or
Okay, so all those people are presumably going to be consumers when they come to your country.
100%.
Okay, what else? You haven't struck on my big pet peeve yet. And those of you in business are going to hate this one because, of course, you're going to hopefully become a business owner someday.
I mean, if you go into like COVID restrictions,
What do you mean?
like just the shutdown of the country, obviously bad for business.
Bad for business in the short term.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh yeah, totally 100%. But actually not so bad if you can reopen fully sooner,
Yeah.
like New Zealand, for example.
They're kinda going back, aren't
They did have to go back. But once again, they locked down and then they're gonna unlock again earlier because they actually established lockdowns. We actually never locked down. We never quarantined. We throw these words around, lockdown and quarantine, like they have no meaning. But New Zealand locked down. The only way you could get groceries is by ordering them from your grocery store and having them delivered to your house. And that wasn't just for the wealthy people, that was every person in New Zealand. the only way to get groceries was to order them from your grocery store and have somebody from the grocery store deliver them to your stoop. Because you literally weren't allowed to leave your house. That's a lockdown, that's a quarantine. We have no idea what a lockdown and a quarantine is in this country. But that is also not what I was thinking of. Tax breaks to businesses. Why would a congressperson, a member of the House of Representatives, or a senator give big tax breaks to businesses? What's the rationale there? What's the rationale that they tell you?
Like from a federal level?
At a federal level, this is a federal tax break to businesses.
Well, I mean, like the whole trickle-down economics argument, like promote hiring new people and paying your employees more.
So if you get a tax break from the government so that you now have more cash on hand,
Reinvest.
you create steel pipe for infrastructure projects. Presumably, if there's a market for your steel pipe, what are you going to do? If there's a market for your steel pipe and you can't produce enough steel pipe to satisfy that market, what are you going to do?
Raise prices. Well, raise prices or try to produce more.
You're going to either raise prices or you're going to try and produce more. Chances are you're going to try and produce more, because if you can just produce more at the same price that you're currently selling at, you gobble up a bigger share of the market. If, on the other hand, you're already producing as much pipe as the market can absorb, why would you hire more people to produce more pipe? If you hire more people to produce more pipe simply because you've got this pulse of cash from the federal government in the form of a tax break, what's going to happen to the unit price of each foot of pipe that you produce?
Go down.
It's going to go down because you're now producing more. The market was already absorbing all of the product that you had to produce. So if you produce more, you're just contributing to supply, and we know that as supply increases, price goes down. There's absolutely no incentive for a firm that is already satisfying the market to increase production simply because they have more cash laying around. So they're not going to increase production, so they're not going to hire more people. Why would you not take that cash and give your employees a raise?
Because I can take it.
Hmm?
Because I can take it.
Well, because you can take it, or you could pay it out in dividends to your shareholders, to your stockholders. If you give a person a raise and in 5 years, because an administration changes, that tax benefit goes away, what are you stuck with at that point?
Expectations.
You're stuck with a bunch of higher paid workers that you either need to encourage to get rid of, or fire without cause, which brings all sorts of complications with it. You're stuck with those higher wage workers. So if you get a tax break from the government to a business, the business, once again, unless it's in an industry that has a market that is not being satisfied with the current production, they're neither going to increase the rate of hiring, nor are they going to increase wages. It just doesn't make a darn bit of sense. And these people are smart people, they should know better. What's that?
They do.
I suspect that they do. And now you're just gonna make me jaded, Adam, so be quiet for a while. Hy-Vee could have left the Hy-Vee building there, built another Hy-Vee, and put it in a place where there aren't any supermarkets. If you put your supermarket in a place where there's not any supermarkets, everybody in that part of town is going to shop at your supermarket. You basically moved into an environment where there isn't a ton of competition. But rather than do that, Hy-Vee built a new store that's shiny and new and glittery in a place where the market is already saturated, and they had to make that supermarket shiny and glittery in order to compete for a set of consumers who have lots of options, and so the competition for those consumers is high. You could have put that new Hy-Vee in a place where competition is not high, and presumably you would have profited from that. Except, what gets in the way? They talk about this in the paper. At the top of page 5. Why do they not do this?
Cultural bias.
So there's cultural bias. Well, okay, so I'll use their words. Stereotypes of perceived urban obstacles. And what's the second one? Logistical obstacles. And they go on to describe what these are. Perceived urban obstacles are many of these things that we think about when we think about the original residential redlining process, aren't they? Perceived urban obstacles, profitability. If we put this supermarket in this neighborhood, that neighborhood is a low-income neighborhood, they're not gonna have very much money to spend, and so our profitability of that supermarket is going to be low. Higher crime. If you're losing more of your product because of higher rates of crime, then once again, that cuts into your profit. Cultural biases, anxiety based on cultural biases about the inner city and minorities, etc. Logistical obstacles include difficulty in finding locations for new stores, which are big typically, purchasing multiple adjacent lots, cost of higher tax rates. But of course, what do we know about tax rates in these particular parts of town? Tax rates are generally lower because property values are generally lower. Higher cost of tax rates, but they do have higher costs of insurance oftentimes because the same companies like banks that used redlining in residential areas, insurance companies also charge people more for insurance in those areas, so insurance rates are going to be higher in those areas. Investors may not fully understand the diversity of food needs and desires of a racially mixed population and hindrances from local politics. So there are all of these perceived obstacles to basically doing what I just advocated, which is taking a supermarket and putting it in a part of town that doesn't have a supermarket. And so the introduction of this is useful to you, I think, in thinking about redlining, not as it applies to residential properties, but as it applies to things like supermarkets. And they go on to then do a complicated analysis, which I'm less concerned about. But what they found ultimately was what? This is probably most cleanly shown in figure 6 at the end of the paper, in the figures at the end of the paper. This is figure 6. The supermarket redlining index is the index that they generated to basically show whether or not a store had the potential to, had the characteristics that indicated that it was in a kind of redlined area. And we see that in all of Hartford, there are only 3 of these that have a low supermarket redlining index score. There's one here, there's one here, and there is a third one. Where did the third one go? Oh, there's 4 of them actually. There's one here, one here, one here right next to this one. There was a third one up here somewhere. 3. And then this is the supermarket redlining impact model score. And the impact of losing a store in a particular area, the darker it is, the higher that impact is going to be. And so when you look at the ones with the supermarket redlining index score that are lowest, they're here, here, and here. And these are also the areas of town that have relatively low impact scores. So if that particular supermarket closes in that particular area, it's not that big of a deal. There are other supermarkets that take the place. If Hy-Vee decided to close their store in Liberty, it's not really a big deal because there are 8 more supermarkets that we can all go and buy food at. On the other hand, in these other places, especially like this one, there aren't really many options nearby that will take the place of that supermarket if that supermarket closes. So that's why it has a supermarket redlining index score that is high, and it's in a zone where the impact of that store closing would have a large impact on food availability on the people who live there if that store suddenly was no longer present. So when we think about redlining as it applies to supermarkets, we can think about the same kinds of financial decisions that are made by banks and lenders and things like this for residential properties as being the same kind of economic concerns that they would have about commercial properties. Hy-Vee doesn't put a supermarket in the middle of a food desert for all of the same reasons that a bank doesn't want to give you a loan for a mortgage for a house in those areas. Which is the same reason that insurance companies charge more for insurance of properties in those areas, etc. So let's look at Kansas City. So I asked you to also look at these maps. So just to go through the background of these maps, about 5 years ago, I divided the class up into 5 different groups. One of the assignments in the class was they had to go to different sections. I split the greater metropolitan area up into 5 different geographic areas, and I asked the students to basically find all of the food outlets that were not restaurants, but were convenience stores, full-service supermarkets, and specialty food stores in the different areas. And so a convenience store is something like Cody's, or a gas station that also has food inside of it, which is most gas stations nowadays. A full-service supermarket is one of these things, and a specialty shop might be a butcher shop or a bakery or something like that, where you basically can buy one aspect of the spectrum of food that is available. And I asked them to give me the name of the establishment, give me the physical address of the establishment, and also give me the latitude and longitude of the location of the establishment. And after I got it in, I discovered that there were some keystroke errors, because there were some establishments that were way out of the Kansas City area, and it's because somebody typed in a latitude and a longitude incorrectly. And I put this into a statistical analysis program called R, and R has the ability to do lots of things, but one of the things it has the ability to do is you can actually deal with geographic data as well as other types of data. And what we did after that was we just basically plotted all of the students' data. And so convenience stores are the red dots, full service grocery stores are the green triangles, and specialty food stores are the blue squares. And some patterns emerge if you look at these, and I also provided on the Moodle site PDFs so that you can blow the map up and still maintain resolution well, so you can zoom in on parts of the city. So for example, you can see that there's this north-south line. This is North Oak Traffic Way, and you can see that there are a lot of stores along North Oak Traffic Way. This is just to kind of get you oriented to the city. This is the Missouri River going through the center of town. Downtown is down here, Independence is over here, Overland Park down here. This is Liberty. What do you notice about Liberty? All those green triangles right there around the intersection of I-35 and 152, and then the one triangle up there at the price chopper on North 291. So what you can do with these data is you can then calculate the density of food stores per square mile, for example. And it creates a density function. And when you plot this density function, it basically gives you a topographic map. And the topographic map represents peaks where there's a lot of food availability. So you see there's a little peak of food availability here in Liberty. There's a big mountain of food availability down here in the southwest part of the city. But when you get to kind of this inner portion here, you're in a valley of food availability. And this is present when you consider all food types, whether you're considering convenience stores, full service supermarkets, or specialty stores. If we then look at just convenience stores, sorry, I have these out of order in my head. So this is what it looks like. This is what the redlining maps look like from the Mapping Inequality website. And you can see that the green areas, so the city, the greater Kansas City metropolitan area back in the 1930s was considerably more compact than it is today. And what you see is that this mountain of food availability over here is right on the edge of those green and blue zoned areas. This valley of food lack of availability is actually right in these areas that were zoned red and yellow back in the 1930s. If you look at convenience stores, you see the convenience stores are relatively evenly distributed throughout the Kansas City area. You see that they still follow a peak of density down here in the Overland Park area. But once you get around, you get away from there, every place else is pretty much at similar levels of density. So convenience stores don't necessarily follow the same rules as other kinds of food outlets. Convenience stores are exactly that. They are placed for convenience. And once again, we can superimpose the redlining on that. And the redlining doesn't really affect this basically flat area over here as much as it's just Overland Park has a lot of convenience stores. Probably because people there commute a lot because they're commuting into the city for their jobs, because they're living in the suburbs out there in Overland Park and Olathe, and they have, that's relatively new construction, they have a lot of convenience stores. But when we look at full service grocery stores, it's not apparent by looking at the little dots on the map, but as soon as you plot the density over this, you see that there is a mound of food availability here, a mound of food availability in the Independence, and Independence going out towards Lee Summit, and a mound of food availability in the Northland, and this section in the center of the city is once again this valley of lack of food availability. At full service establishments. And when we superimpose the redlined areas, you can see that this valley of low food availability is right there in that section that was categorized as C and D quality real estate back in the 1930s. Northland wasn't classified at all because there wasn't a lot of development back in the 1930s north of the city, but that is where a lot of food density exists now. Overland Park, once again, this is on the very edge of that area that was singled out as being a good place for future development. And then specialty stores kind of mimic this, although they're just way fewer specialty stores, but not surprising. You find an aggregation of specialty stores down in Overland Park, and then to a lesser degree over in Independence, and then the northern part of the city is abundance. A lot of this specialty area down here, there, you can see that there's this little ridge of food availability. Probably is, once again, a historic factor having to do with the fact that meat processing plants and things like that have traditionally been linked to rail lines. So when you get down into the river bottoms where the rail yards are, you find more specialty butcher shops and things like that down in that area. The old Italian section of town is also known for having a lot of butcher shops associated with those establishments. You guys ever eaten at the local pig? You've never eaten at the local pig?
Where is it?
It's actually down in the river bottoms. It's down in the river bottoms, right in that section where all those low-grade Italians settled in the 1930s.
I think I might have.
The local pig is a butcher shop, and right next to them they have a food truck called Pigwitch. You can go there and get sandwiches that are made from the stuff that is at the butcher shop. And so this little finger of specialty food stores here in the Northland is tied to those specialty meat processing areas that once again have a historic origin. And once again, you can see this is the redlined area, and there's less of an impact because some of this redlined area was probably redlined because it had industries like meat packing industries in them back in the day. So we can zoom in on this and just zoom right in on the area that is redlined. So this is the redlined area shown on modern geography. This is 435 coming down here, 435 loop. This is Interstate 35 coming through the center of town. And once again, we can look at these density diagrams, and once again you see pockets of food availability outside of those areas and a valley of lack of availability in the middle. That is less apparent with convenience stores. You see that there's a little ridge that goes right into the redlined area. Once again, that's probably due to the presence of gas stations primarily. But when we look at full service food stores, once again, the segregation of food availability is much more pronounced where full service food stores are considered. And you have the valley, the lowest level of food availability is right here in the center of this redlined area. And then once again, it's similar with specialty stores, except for this ridge right here in the middle, which represents that meat packing area. So one of the questions for you is, especially where full service supermarkets are concerned, do you think redlining had an effect? Redlining from back in the 1930s has had an effect on the distribution of full service supermarkets here in the year 2021. And if you do, what would be your evidence to say that that's true? And if you don't, what would be your evidence to say that that's not true? This is one of the things that I ask you to address in your paper.
You could just go with like the correlation of full service grocery stores to redlined areas.
Yeah, so I didn't make up these data. These data were gathered by students, and I didn't create the analysis. This is just an algorithm within R for creating density diagrams showing you where things are densely distributed versus not densely distributed. This is the pattern that emerges. To me, there seems to be a pattern where areas that were traditionally redlined back in the 1930s are those areas that tend to not have as many full-service supermarkets, and areas that lie outside of those redlined areas tend to have more full-service supermarkets. And it strikes me as fairly compelling that the highest density is right on the edge of what was zoned blue and green back in the day. And that was basically bankers signaling to real estate investors, go and invest in these areas. And that's why, for a long time, Kansas City grew much faster to the south and west as Kansas City grew as a metroplex, rather than expanding north. What's another reason why Kansas City didn't expand north as fast as it expanded south? If you commute from the Northland into the city to go to work, you know about this in spades. What's a significant barrier to northward expansion of the Kansas City Metroplex? Yeah, you have this huge river, and in order to get across it, you have to go over a bridge, and there are a limited number of bridges. Whenever there's bridge work done on one of the bridges, you can see that the traffic pattern totally changes. Because you can't go over that bridge anymore, you have to go to one of the other bridges, and so other bridges that were not congested before that bridge work was being done, those things are now more congested than they were. So the presence of a river prevented for a long time serious expansion northwards, and so for a long time most of the expansion was southward, but it wasn't southward uniformly, it was southward in the southwest area of the city that was zoned, that was redlined back in the day as green zones and blue zones rather than red and yellow zones. And so you see the green and blue area right here, and you see all of the expansion has been down this direction. What else has encouraged expansion down through Overland Park and Olathe? And this is actually due to something that happened back in the Eisenhower administration back in the 1950s. Yeah.
Transportation, increased transportation related highways.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit. What do you know about Dwight Eisenhower?
I came up with the, well, probably not him exclusively, but his administration is responsible for the national highway system.
Yeah, the interstate highway system. So if you're traveling through Kansas, through the Flint Hills, you will see that there are signs that say there's section out. I think it's out near Manhattan, and there's a sign there, and it says this is the first stretch of the Eisenhower interstate highway system. Eisenhower was a general during World War II, and one of the things that he noticed as he was having to deal with logistical issues of basically fighting a war on two fronts. They started the war in Europe, but then they also had the Pacific War, and so the manufacturing centers in the Great Lakes region would produce things like tanks and ships and all the things that we've talked about when we talked about the historical precedents for increasing productivity in agriculture. Those areas were centered in the Great Lakes, what's now the Rust Belt, but was the major manufacturing center of the United States. And they had to get things from there to the East Coast, which was relatively easy because we had good rail lines already established there, and the distance wasn't huge. But getting those products from the Great Lakes region to the West Coast to be used in the war in the Pacific was much more problematic. And when Eisenhower was a general back in World War II, he was confronted with this logistical difficulty, and he viewed the lack of a good highway infrastructure in the western part of the United States as a serious strategic mistake that needed to be rectified. And so during his administration as president, he basically put in place a system for building a set of high-capacity interstate highways that would connect vehicle traffic across broad swaths of the American West, and they've expanded into all 50 states. And as you can see, this black line here is Interstate 35, and it goes all the way through Overland Park and out to Olathe. So another reason that this expansion occurred, moving out of the center city towards Overland Park and Olathe, is that with the establishment of Interstate 35, it made making a commute into the city to work more reasonable if you're living in one of these outlying areas. And so that's another reason that you see this growth from the 1950s to 2021 in that particular section of town. Is it's all about transportation. You can't move to the north because transportation is inhibited by the presence of a river. but you can more easily move to the south because you're not inhibited by that river, and also you have this interstate highway system that now facilitates movement, so that you can live in Olathe and you can be in the center of Kansas City in 30 minutes in rush hour traffic. And so it isn't just redlining that led to these patterns, but it's redlining combined with changes in travel infrastructure, in vehicular infrastructure, geographic barriers that encouraged development in one part of the city rather than the other part of the city. So it's not just redlining, but certainly, at least based on these maps, redlining probably had something to do with things. Oh wow, it's more striking than I remember it being. I've just drawn a polygon around a section of town where there's no full-service supermarket. If I was Hy-Vee, and if there are people that live there, and there are people that live there, I'd put a supermarket somewhere inside that polygon. But nobody's killing themselves to put a supermarket in Kansas City, Kansas. There was an article back in August 13th, I think, story done on KCUR basically talking about the fact that there was a supermarket in Kansas City, Kansas that closed recently and nobody's replaced it with anything, and now the people of Kansas City, Kansas have to go a pretty far distance in order to get groceries. August 13th, 2021, the local NPR station doing a story about this food desert that exists right over here. It's current. It's real. It has a real impact on people who live in those places. Those of us who live in Liberty, we have 9 options. Other people don't have any. Thoughts? Thought?
This will be very basic, but in some, there is a very strong correlation between communities that have been redlined historically and where supermarkets will be willing to invest and develop.
It seems that way to me. Is that how you're reading those graphs? When I first had students do this, I had no idea what it was going to show. And once again, before I had the availability of the georeference redlining maps, because when they put up the mapping inequality website, they had the map scanned, but they didn't have them georeferenced. And it was only a couple of years later that they got georeferencing, such that I could easily import them in to R and get them actually placed on the city map of Kansas City. And then that enabled us to explore it even in more detail. And that's when kind of the patterns really emerged. To me, was being able to overlay those different data types on top of one another.
Oh, importantly, the data is just for Kansas City.
This is just data from Kansas City. In theory, you could do the same type of analysis for any city in the country that had these redlining maps for them, which is essentially every major metropolitan center in the country. Cameron was mentioning the other day that he lived in Arlington, Texas, on the border of one of these areas that had been redlined, and after he told me that, I was like, I haven't gone and looked at the redlining maps for the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but it's on my list of things to do because I used to live there. I went to graduate school there, and it would be informative. If you go to the Mapping Inequality website, one of the first things that they ask you when you log on is they ask you for your location, and if you click Don't Allow, it just gives you the whole national map. If you click Allow, it takes you to your particular city. So you could, in theory, go to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and you could look at the redlining maps, you could look at the distribution of supermarkets in those areas, and do this similar type of analysis and see what it showed. You could do that in Chicago, you could do it in Detroit, you could do it in any of these cities. Once again, think about Dallas versus Fort Worth. These are two cities that lie right next to one another. You see that in Fort Worth, there's a larger proportion of the town in the 1930s that was redlined relative to the amount in Dallas. Part of that is probably due to the fact that Dallas is an older town than Fort Worth is. And so it was developing during this time period in history because it was relatively undeveloped, and because a lot of the part of early Fort Worth was related to, once again, meat packing industries and things like this. It attracted people to Fort Worth who were in these low-wage class earner categories that would have been indicative of the type of people that banks and lenders would have redlined at the time. It would not surprise me at all if when we look at Fort Worth, we find exactly what we would expect. A lot of the redlined areas are down here around the stockyards, where the cattle that were leaving for markets in the west would be put on trains in the Fort Worth stockyards and shipped out. And people who worked in those stockyards probably lived in the vicinity of the stockyards, and those would have been low-wage earning people. And so those sections of towns got redlined. Once again, what I know of Fort Worth doesn't surprise me at all when I then go and look at the redline maps. Any other observations or questions? All right. Instructions for the paper are on the website. You have been sent a gajillion surveys for filling out